The top Formula One teams are currently crying out against the $140 million budget cap. According to big names like Mercedes and Ferrari, it is simply impossible to reduce their spending due to the overall increase in the cost of running their teams. Why is this causing an uproar then in the Formula One world? Does this mean the end of the dominance of the big names? Keep watching to find out. Red Bull, Ferrari and Mercedes all fear they are in danger of being penalized for exceeding the sport's budget caps this season. Christian Horner, who is in charge of Red Bull, has urged the FIA to act soon to avoid a so-called accounting world championship. Horner stated that his team might end up with more people in the financial department than in the design office. He made this statement because, in his opinion, nobody wants to see Formula One become what he terms an accounting world championship, rather than a technical or athletic one. All F1 teams are subject to a cost cap of $140 million or £119 million for 2022, with the goal of improving the general nature of the competition. However, a huge jump in inflation and freight costs has put teams' budgets under unforeseen strain. Formula One teams are at odds over the budget limit. The larger teams prefer increasing the existing $140 million maximum due to inflation, which has driven up energy expenses, as well as logistical costs, which are higher due to increased demand and lengthier travel routes following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ferrari team manager Mattia Binotto stated that there is no possible solution for them to keep below the restriction, while Red Bull's Christian Horner stated that surely all of the major teams will break that $140 million limitation this year. Nobody could have predicted the global circumstances that are driving inflation when the teams and the FIA sat together and agreed on these numbers. The teams have no idea what the inflation rate will be in the second half of the year. The cost of living is growing around the world, and Formula One teams have their utility expenditures skyrocketing. If that is already happening now, then what's going to happen in the next 6 months? They are eager to find a common sense solution for Formula One, stressing the risk to the future of the sport and the possibility of future layoffs. However, not everyone is crying about their current situation. Some teams have already implemented that common sense option. Alfa Romeo apparently feel they can work around this restriction. The CEO, Frederick Vasseur, said that if their energy or freight prices rise, the ideal solution is to turn off the wind tunnel and stop bringing updates to the cars every weekend. According to him, everyone is in the same predicament, and sooner or later, the teams will have to cease development on their cars since they will have reached the limit of their budget. Vasseur believes everyone else can do the same. Alpine team principal Otmar Schaffnauer also had something to say about the budget cap. He stated that most teams do their budgeting for the following year in the November-December timeframes, and Alpine is no different. Inflation was already around the 7% mark at the time. The retail price index in England was 7.1%, while in Wales it was 7.2%. He claims Alpine took that into account when they created our budget and planned out all of their development work. Despite the fact that freight was slightly more expensive than expected, they were still well within their budget. By the end of the year, they plan to make the necessary changes to the development. In his words, where there is a will, there is definitely a way, and we established a budget cap that we must adhere to. Quite clearly, this thorny issue is expected to rage on, with more and more arguments taking place behind the scenes. Red Bull, Ferrari and Mercedes, the world's largest and most competitive teams, have all emphasized that the budget cap should be raised due to force majeure circumstances, which is a term used for unforeseeable situations that prevent the teams from fulfilling the obligations of the contracts they signed. However, there is a strong resistance from the teams we have mentioned. Alfa Romeo and Alpine see no reason to raise the cap. Alfa Romeo's Fred Vasseur stated that the teams might simply finish building their cars sooner, lowering expenses. He said, "It isn't a case of force majeure because inflation isn't a case of force majeure." Red Bull team principal Horner, who has been the most outspoken on this situation, told Sky Sports F1 that nobody could have foreseen what was going on in the globe at the time they all agreed to those cutbacks, and how it is pushing inflation in every household internationally. We can, however, all see the effects of inflation in Formula One. We see it in logistics. We see it in energy costs. That is something the FIA should surely consider. year. They've already got the capacity to apply an inflationary effect due to the force majeure circumstances, since the teams didn't have enough means to go below the cap. That is undoubtedly true for 7 of the Formula One teams. There are still 6 months left this year, and inflation appears to be climbing rather than decreasing, and perhaps the FIA will move soon. Ferrari's Mattia Binotto stated that he agreed with his rival team leader and added, "I do not believe we will be able to stay below, so I'm very sure we will go over at some point." It seems this leader has already accepted his fate. Currently, there is a 5% threshold specified in the regulations. If the teams don't exceed that 5% on top of their budget cap, well, it will be regarded as a minor breach. And what constitutes as a minor breach in the event of force majeure? In terms of fines, what will the stewards and the FIA decide? Nobody knows, but there doesn't seem to be a way out for the big names. Even firing some of their staff doesn't seem like the ethical choice to make. Mercedes is also siding with their grid competitors on this one. Toto Wolff noted that the cost cap was set for specific purposes, which is there to allow small teams to spend the same amount as larger teams. There shouldn't be a yearly bargaining session to raise the cost cap. However, he believes that we are in a unique circumstance, and that we currently are experiencing actual inflation of more than 7%. Mercedes energy prices in Brackley have increased, as have their freight costs. Wolff believes that it's something that must be examined because the team does not want to risk reorganizing and restructuring their organization in a way that would be detrimental to them as a competitor. This is quite clearly a force majeure situation, with a raging war in Ukraine and the ramifications for energy prices that no one could have predicted. Some sort of compromise must be reached between the teams that are opposed to the inflationary adjustment and the teams that support it. Horner, on the other hand, stated that increasing the budget was not about additional parts. Horner, whose Red Bull team led both the Drivers' and Constructors' Championships thanks to Max Verstappen, said Formula One's governing body, the FIA, must address the issue. The FIA has a duty of care, and they should take that duty seriously. Red Bull hasn't introduced that many components, especially in comparison to a typical season. Of course, they are attempting to be very selective in the parts they produce, but it's a whole different method and approach. I believe what we need is clarity, and we need it immediately, he said. Because, quite simply, it is not ethical for the bigger teams to be held hostage by a couple of ineffective teams, because that was never the intention of the budget cap. The budget constraint was put in place to keep the top clubs from going on a spending spree. 7 of the teams would definitely need to miss the last 4 races this year to stay well below the cap. It's not only about the major league teams. Teams in the middle of the field are also most affected by inflationary difficulties. However, the Alfa Romeo, Alpine, Haas, and Williams teams all voted against an inflationary adjustment based on International Monetary Fund inflation figures. The adjustment was proposed last month at the Formula One Commission meeting of teams, the FIA, and commercial rights holders. An Aston Martin official stated, "We support a budget cap rise in line with inflation, but do not see the necessity for an increase bigger than that." According to a spokeswoman, the FIA is continuing to investigate the matter. Some teams are concerned that the top teams are advocating for a budget cap hike in order to retain their high expenditure levels. Some of the smaller teams have budgets that are lower than the cap, and they argued that raising it would just promote disparity throughout the field, which is contrary to the goal of the FIA and F1 regulation amendments. Furthermore, some reports also claim that the larger teams are attempting to compound the effects of inflation into the next year, which may result in a $15 million increase in the cap. The cap was implemented last year as one of several measures to level the playing field and close the gaps between teams. It began at $145 million in 2021 and is expected to fall by another $5 million in 2023. However, the larger teams contrast their flexible approach during the COVID crisis in 2020 with what they perceive to be the smaller teams' rigidity now. Prior to the pandemic, the budget cap was planned to be at $175 million in 2021. However, in the early months of the pandemic, the major clubs agreed to a $30 million price cut due to the perceived threat COVID faced against the sport's survival. According to the leading teams, the cost of air freight has climbed by 50% this year, and the utilities needed to power their facilities and factories are up to 3 times higher than what they were previously. They claim that if the cap is not raised, they will have to choose between not attending races and firing hundreds of individuals across the sector. They also also contend that if the bulk of the grid breaches this threshold this year, then the cap's legitimacy is jeopardized. The penalties for exceeding the cap are not specified. However, if the valuation is substantial enough, a team may be disqualified from the competition. Currently, nobody can say where this situation is going to head. Hopefully, it doesn't end in the demise of this respected sport. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.